The page of future history will tell how Britain planted, nourished, and for 2 centuries preserved a second British Empire. How, strengthened by her sons, she rose to such a pitch of power that this little island proved too mighty for the greatest efforts of the greatest nations. Within the space of 20 years, the world beheld her arms triumphant in every quarter of the globe.
It's incredibly striking language. Victorious banners, conquest gracing the canvas.
It is. But that striking eloquence, it's really just the preamble to a much darker observation.
Yes, because you have to consider the context. That was delivered by the Duke of Manchester to the House of Lords in November of 1775.
Exactly. So the conflict is already raging, he continues. Historic truth must likewise relate how Britain fell to half her greatness, how strangely lost by misjudging ministers, by rash advised councils, a gracious sovereign, George III, saw more than half his empire crumble beneath his scepter.
And then the final, fatal line. America, late the strength, now the foe to Britain, dismembered, torn, I fear forever lost to England when she sprung.
That speech, I think, just perfectly encapsulates the tragic irony of it all. Britain achieves this stunning global victory in the Seven Years' War, and almost immediately, the seeds of its greatest imperial failure are sown.
It's an immense subject, the American Revolution. For Americans, of course, it's the foundation of their national identity. But in Britain, as the Duke's speech suggests, it became this moment of colossal failure, a crisis that was, largely relegated to a historical footnote, almost papered over by greater global commitments later on.
So in this podcast, we're going to dissect how Britain went from that global triumph to losing such a vital portion of its empire. And to do that, to really understand the breach, we have to first establish what the colonies were actually like before everything began to change.
Right, before the imperial structure began to shift around them.
So if we go back to the 1750s, maybe the early 1760s, what do we find in those 13 colonies that would eventually rebel?
Well, the first thing you notice is that this is not some struggling backwater. We're looking at a society that was remarkably prosperous, confident, and just, experiencing explosive population growth.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
By the time this period of conflict really kicks off, you're looking at roughly 1.5 million people. And this prosperity wasn't just on paper.
No, the physical evidence is quite extraordinary. The research shows us something fascinating from the Royal Navy's calculations.
Oh, the height difference.
Exactly. The Royal Navy, in making calculations for manpower, determined that the colonial population was, on average, 2 inches taller than the population of England.
And that one statistic, just a simple difference in stature, it speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It really does. It points to better nutritional standards, greater resource availability, just a higher general standard of living compared to the much more crowded conditions back in the metropole.
And it speaks not just to resources, but to a burgeoning sense of confidence, an awareness of their own increasing economic and, well, physical strength. But maybe more critical to the coming conflict than even prosperity was their tradition of self-governance.
A tradition that had evolved almost organically.
Yes, largely due to London's neglect. This is absolutely crucial to understanding why they reacted the way they did later.
So what did that self-governance actually look like on the ground? I mean, the colonies had very different origins, royal, proprietary.
They did. The charters varied wildly. Some were granted by the crown, others were basically owned by individuals or companies. But the key is that all 13 colonies had, by this point, established forms of representative government.
So they all had their own elected assemblies.
Exactly. Elected assemblies, often mirroring the structure of the House of Commons. And critically, these assemblies had significant control over two things: the purse strings, so they voted on taxation and expenditure, and the salary of the royal governor.
Which is a huge lever of power.
A huge lever. It meant that in practice, the assemblies, the local representatives, held the real balance of power. The governor might represent the king, but the assembly paid his wages.
And this local control must have led to wider political participation than you'd see in Britain itself.
Much wider. They used the same basic requirement, the property franchise. You had to own a certain amount of land to vote. But the difference was land in the colonies was vastly more accessible and cheaper.
So far, more people qualified.
Far more. In many areas, you're looking at over 50% of free white men being able to vote. That's a massive contrast to the very narrowly restricted electorate back in Britain.
And in some places, like New England, this political activity was woven into the very fabric of society.
That's right. New England had this strong tradition of the town meeting. This was a forum where citizens would actively engage in local affairs, voting on, well, Everything, from fence repairs to religious matters.
It's a practical training ground for politics.
It is. So for people living under this system, the authority of Parliament in London, it seemed distant, it seemed theoretical, and for the most part, irrelevant to their daily lives.
Yet despite that practical separation, they still saw themselves as Englishmen.
Oh, absolutely. Fiercely patriotic Englishmen. That's a point that cannot be overstated. Right up until the final breach in 1776, their identity was tied to the British crown, to the political liberties they believed were guaranteed under the glorious revolution of 1689.
They felt entitled to all the ancient rights as Englishmen.
All of them. And in a way, their internal disunity reinforced this singular allegiance to Britain.
That's an interesting point. We tend to talk about the 13 colonies as if they were a single entity.
But history tells us they really weren't. Intercolonial interaction was minimal. Geographically, culturally, it was often easier and quicker to get from Boston to London than it was to travel overland from Boston to, say, Charlestown in South Carolina.
So there were 13 distinct entities.
Distinct economic, religious, and political entities, often competing with each other rather than cooperating. The only things they really shared were their allegiance to the king and their relationship with the governing apparatus in London.
And what did that governing apparatus actually look like before the mid-1760s? What was the British footprint?
Before the 7 Years' War, it was astonishingly slight. Supervision from London was distant, often confused. They had a complex mercantilist system, the navigation laws, designed to restrict colonial trade to the mother country.
But in practice?
In practice, the system was notoriously leaky. Enforcement was lax, smuggling was widespread, and the Crown followed a policy that became known as benign neglect. For decades, London just let the colonies prosper with minimal interference. The belief was simple. Prosperous colonies are loyal colonies.
A dynamic that the 7 Years' War would completely shatter.
Completely and irrevocably.
So let's turn to that war, known in North America as the French and Indian War. For British administrators in Whitehall, in the mid-18th century, the 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard weren't their primary strategic concern, were they?
Not at all. Their focus was firmly on Europe and the global balance of power. The great strategic worry in North America was the French. This massive French imperial presence stretching from Canada down the Mississippi, essentially blocking British expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains.
So what was happening in Boston or Philadelphia was secondary.
Entirely secondary. So long as revenue was being generated and things were stable, the main game was the French.
And the conflict that followed from 1754 to 63, it pitted the British against two major foes, the French Empire and the sizable Native American confederations who were allied with them.
And the British victory was total. The French were expelled from the New World. It was a hinge point in imperial history.
Because it created two immediate, irreversible changes.
Exactly. First, it eliminated the French threat, which had, for a long time, been the primary reason the colonists needed British military protection. It was the glue holding them to the empire. Second, and this is crucial, it necessitated the establishment of a huge, permanent British military and administrative presence in North America for the first time.
The era of benign neglect was over.
It was over. It was replaced by an imperial administration that felt, quite rightly, that it had just saved the colonists from the French and now needed to manage and police this vast new territory.
But we have to stress, the 13 colonies that rebelled, they were only half of the British colonies in the New World.
That's right. There were 26 in total. Which brings us to the Caribbean priority, something that's often overlooked when we study the Revolution.
It's essential for understanding London's decision-making.
Absolutely. The British government's primary concern, economically, was centered on the incredibly lucrative sugar islands, Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua. These were the crown jewels of the empire.
And the economic disparity is just staggering. If you look at the numbers, mainland North America's largest crop was tobacco. That sold for an average of about 750,000 pounds annually.
Which sounds like a lot.
Until you compare it to the West Indies, their produce sugar, molasses, rum averaged nearly 4 million pounds annually.
An order of magnitude more valuable. So the colonies that rebelled were important politically, strategically, but economically, they were secondary to the sugar plantations. This financial reality meant that London's priorities were often not aligned with those of the mainland colonists.
And even in the early stages of that war against the French, the colonists were deeply involved and at that point intensely loyal. You see it with figures like a young George Washington.
Right, in General Braddock's disastrous expedition in 1755 to capture Fort Duquesne. Washington is there as a young officer and aide-de-camp, and he is keenly seeking a prestigious commission in the regular British Army.
And Benjamin Franklin, too, furnishing 150 wagons for that same effort.
Their actions really underscore the fact that these men were not anti-British. They were fiercely pro-British expansionists, and their involvement reveals the primary driving force for so many of them: the hunger for land.
Specifically, land in the Ohio Valley.
Yes. Washington, despite coming from a wealthy Virginia family, was actually heavily indebted. He, like hundreds of thousands of others, saw his path to real wealth through Western land speculation.
He was a land surveyor by trade, after all.
Indeed. So his personal financial investment in pushing beyond the Appalachians was representative of this huge, widespread colonial demand for those rich Western lands. They had fought the war, they had endured the hardships, and now they expected the spoils.
The freedom to move west, an expectation that would set them on a direct collision course with Whitehall the moment the peace was signed.
Precisely. The glorious British victory in 1763 brought with it what historians have called the problems of peace, and they were almost entirely financial.
The cost of that victory was ruinous.
It was catastrophic for the British state at the time. The sheer numbers are hard to comprehend. Britain's national debt in 1763 stood at an astronomical £137 million.
And to put that into perspective,
The interest payments alone on that debt amounted to £5 million per year. The entire peacetime annual budget for the government before the war was only £8 million.
so the interest payments were more than half the pre-war budget. It's a complete fiscal crisis.
An undeniable crisis. And the administrators in Whitehall felt entirely justified in seeking new sources of revenue from the empire they had just spent so much blood and treasure to secure.
And that crushing financial burden immediately led to two completely conflicting conclusions on either side of the Atlantic about what should happen next.
That's right. The British government in London looked at the situation and concluded that for the long-term stability of the empire and to avoid another cripplingly expensive war, it was essential to keep the powerful Native American confederations allied, or at least satisfied.
Which meant restraining the colonists.
It meant restraining that aggressive white push inland. The Crown needed peace and stability above all else to recover financially.
But the colonists, of course, drew the exact opposite lesson.
The opposite. For them, the French were gone, the land was now secure. Now was the time to cross the Appalachians and settle those rich lands they had fought for. And this inherent conflict, British fiscal stability versus colonial expansion, it became the foundational, irreconcilable breach.
Which leads directly to the Royal Proclamation line of 1763.
It does. This was the British government's attempt to draw a line on the map running roughly along the crest of the Appalachians and say, this far and no further, at least for now.
The word temporarily is key there.
It is, but the purpose was practical. Stop the immediate conflict. But a line on a map is useless without enforcement. And this is the critical point. It required British regular troops, a substantial standing army, to police that vast frontier.
And someone had to pay for those troops.
Someone had to pay for them. And this became the central source of conflict. The government in London insisted that the colonies should contribute to the cost of their own defense.
And the need for that army was brutally underscored just as the line was being drawn.
By Pontiac's Rebellion, also in 1763, this was a major coordinated uprising across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. It killed approximately 2,000 settlers. It was a stark demonstration of the lethal reality of the frontier.
There's that one anecdote about the massacre at Fort Michilimackinac.
The lacrosse game.
Yes.
The Native Americans staged an elaborate game right outside the fort walls. The garrison was watching, entertained. Then they intentionally threw the ball inside the fort.
And when they rushed in to get it, they grabbed hidden weapons and slaughtered the garrison.
It was brutal, and it was effective. And for Whitehall, events like that confirmed their belief that a large, costly military presence was completely unavoidable. From their perspective in 1763, the decisions they made were entirely rational.
They're managing a huge, complex world empire. They have a shaky domestic tax base. The British people were already the most taxed in Europe, and they're looking at the colonies.
And they see cheap land, low taxes, and immense prosperity. So when the colonists resist contributing even a small amount to their own defense, it's seen as, frankly, intolerable.
So in 1763, the new prime minister, George Grenville, decides this has to end. The benign neglect is over.
It's the beginning of a deliberate process to professionalize and modernize the governance of the British Empire. The goal was simple, really. Raise just enough revenue to defray a portion of the cost of that standing army and crack down on the smuggling that was robbing the crown of customs duties.
And that attempt at modernization immediately brings Britain's core constitutional principle into direct conflict with colonial tradition.
Parliamentary supremacy. For any British administrator, Whig or Tory, the glorious revolution of 1689 had settled the matter. Parliament was sovereign. Power vested in the king and Parliament was indivisible. If Parliament could legislate for the whole empire, it could tax the whole empire. That was, for them, non-negotiable.
But for the colonists who had been governing and taxing themselves for over a century and who had no actual representatives in Westminster,
They fundamentally rejected it. Their objection was famously stated, if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands and everything we possess or make use of? They saw an internal tax imposed by a body they hadn't elected as subjugation.
this gets to the heart of the legal argument over representation, doesn't it? The British argued for virtual representation.
Yes, the idea that every member of Parliament represented the interests of all British subjects everywhere, even those who couldn't vote for him. The colonists rejected this entirely. They insisted on no taxation without actual representation.
And this constitutional disagreement framed their political strategy, this maneuver of trying to appeal to the king against Parliament.
Precisely. Up until the very end, they insisted on their loyalty to the crown. They sent petition after petition to King George III, effectively asking him to act unconstitutionally, to override his own parliament.
Something he was never going to do.
Never. George III was a firm believer in the constitutional settlement that put his family on the throne. He saw himself as a patriot king who ruled through Parliament, not above it. So these petitions were simply ignored or redirected back to Parliament.
Which means the famous focus on George III as the tyrant, the one we see in the Declaration of Independence.
That was a political maneuver that only happened at the very, very end in 1776. They needed a single figure to blame. Before that, they genuinely revered the king and saw Parliament as the true oppressor.
The real tragedy here seems to be a complete failure of conversation.
It is. Both sides are acting reasonably according to their own established principles, but they're just. They're talking past one another almost from the beginning.
And that lack of communication just bred more and more mistrust.
It created a feedback loop of paranoia, especially on the American side. They couldn't believe their constitutional arguments were just being dismissed. So they concluded there must be some kind of grand conspiracy by corrupt ministers in London to subjugate them, to reduce them to slavery.
Which brings us to the first major legislative action of this new era, the Sugar Act of 1764.
And the first extraordinary fact about the Sugar Act is that it actually cut the tax on imported foreign molasses from 6 pence a gallon down to 3 pence.
So on paper, it's a tax cut, but that wasn't the point.
No, the flashpoint wasn't the rate, it was the enforcement. Grenville's government actually intended to collect the 3 pence. The old 6 pence tax had been widely ignored through smuggling. Now, they were going to enforce the law, and that immediately targeted the wealthy merchants of New England.
And the enforcement mechanism was seen as a profound violation of their rights as Englishmen.
Yes. The threat was that smuggling cases could be tried in a vice admiralty court in Halifax, Nova Scotia, without a jury.
Which to a colonist sounded like tyranny.
To them, the right to a trial by a jury of their peers was an ancient right, dating back to Magna Carta. Now, in Britain, it was standard practice for smuggling cases to be heard in these courts without juries, because a local jury would almost always acquit a local smuggler.
A practical necessity for the crown.
But a fundamental violation of liberty to the colonists.
The friction from the Sugar Act, which really only targeted merchants, then escalated very quickly with the Stamp Act in 1765.
The Stamp Act was a game changer. It was designed to spread the financial burden across the entire population. It required colonists to purchase special, stamped paper for almost everything. Legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards.
This was a direct internal tax that affected everyone.
Everyone, especially the most influential people, lawyers, journalists, tavern owners. And Grenville defended it in Parliament by basically accusing the Americans of being freeloaders. He pointed out they were being taxed about a tenth of what people in Britain were paying, which was true.
And that defensive tone often shaded into arrogance.
Yes, you see it in speeches from officials like Charles Townshend. His speech calling Americans children planted by our care, nourished up by our indulgence, was reprinted across the colonies, and it just fueled this sense that London saw them as dependents, not as equals.
Though there were voices in Parliament who pushed back.
There were. Isaac Barré, who had served in the French and Indian War, gave a famous response to Townshend. He argued the colonies were planted by oppressions and grew by neglect, not indulgence. His speeches were circulated in America, and he became an instant hero.
But even among the colonists, the motivations could be, well, complicated, a mix of high principle and self-interest.
Absolutely. The classic example is Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. He's a major critic of the Stamp Act. He even stages a protest with his slaves, describing Grenville as the infamous projector of American slavery.
And yet,
We now know that Lee himself had applied for the job of stamp distributor just before the protest began. It highlights the complexity of what was driving people.
and we should remember, there was real economic distress in the mid-1760s. The post-war economy was struggling, credit was tightening.
That financial anxiety made the populace particularly receptive to this powerful rhetoric. And the rhetoric, Patrick Henry's calls for liberty, it didn't just come from the Enlightenment. It had deeper roots.
In the 17th century British Republican tradition.
Exactly. This tradition, sometimes called the country Whig tradition, was obsessed with protecting individual rights against what it saw as centralized corruption and tyranny. They had a checklist of sorts for identifying tyranny.
And what was on that checklist?
Taxes imposed without consent, the suspension of jury trials, and crucially, the presence of a standing army in peacetime. So when Grenville's government started doing all of these things, for the colonists steeped in this ideology, it looks like a textbook case of a conspiracy to strip them of their freedom.
The main colonial response was immediate and effective. Consumer boycotts.
The non-importation agreements. A very sophisticated use of economic pressure. It worked because it hit British merchants right where they lived, in their profits. They began flooding Parliament with petitions to repeal the act.
And the boycotts broadened the resistance movement.
They did. By focusing on consumer goods, they necessarily involved women, the principal consumers. This led to the craze for homespun cloth, turning a domestic chore into a political statement.
You also see these performative action students at Harvard refusing to drink tea.
Yes, but it wasn't all peaceful. There was also organized violence. Mobs actively intimidated the stamp distributors to make sure the act couldn't be implemented.
The attack on acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house in Boston being a prime example.
And that wasn't random looting. It was described as a careful disassembly. They methodically pulled tiles off the roof, burned his library. It was a clear political signal targeting the man they saw as the face of the Crown's authority.
And this combination of economic pressure and physical intimidation worked. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766.
It was impossible to implement. But Parliament, in a move to save face, refused to concede the constitutional principle.
They passed the Declaratory Act.
At the same time. And it stated that Parliament reserved the right to pass laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. They refused to back down on sovereignty, which guaranteed that the conflict was far from over.
Right. Despite the repeal, the debt was still there. The need for revenue was still there, which led to the Townshend duties in 1767.
This was a renewed effort, a more subtle one. They tried taxing imports external duties rather than internal transactions. But the goal was still revenue generation, not trade regulation. And worse, the money was to be used to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges.
Taking away the colonial assembly's main source of leverage.
Exactly. It undermined their power of the purse. And the continued resistance, particularly in Boston, led Whitehall to make a fateful decision.
They decided the problem was Boston.
Their strategic perspective was that the entire problem was localized to this one city. Its radical press, its high smuggling rates. They thought if they could isolate Boston and subdue it with military force, the other colonies would fall in line.
A major strategic miscalculation.
A huge one. And so in October 1768, 2 regiments of troops arrive in Boston. The military occupation begins.
And the presence of armed troops in a compact city like that, it was bound to create friction.
Inevitable. The soldiers were poorly paid. They took off-duty jobs, competing with locals. There were constant small skirmishes. The tension just builds and builds for 18 months.
Until it explodes on the evening of March 5th, 1770, on King Street.
The Boston Massacre. A small detachment of British troops guarding the customs house confronts a crowd of several hundred Bostonians.
And the accounts of what happened are, of course, completely polarized.
American accounts emphasize snowballs. British accounts emphasize stones, clubs, oyster shells being thrown at the soldiers. The exact chain of events is still contested, but the outcome was that the soldiers fired into the crowd.
And 5 Bostonians were killed.
The British account was self-defense. The American narrative, powerfully captured in Paul Revere's famous engraving, was a cold-blooded massacre of innocents. It was a masterstroke of propaganda.
And that propaganda often left out the leader of the mob.
Crispus Attucks, a towering dock worker, half black and half Native American. He was the first one killed, the first martyr of the cause.
Yet the trial that followed is so important because John Adams, a leader of the resistance, defended the soldiers.
It was a strategic decision. He wanted to show that even British troops could get a fair trial in Boston to undermine the British narrative that the city was lawless.
And his defense strategy was to blame the mob.
He was harsh. He called them a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes, and mulattoes. He basically argued that the soldiers were terrified for their lives and that their panic was justified.
And the jury, for the most part, agreed.
They did. Only 2 soldiers were convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The rest were acquitted. It showed the legal system was still functioning despite the political chaos.
So in 1770, 6 years before the Declaration of Independence, we have to remember that independence was still far from inevitable.
Very far. The colonists were still fighting for their rights as Englishmen within the British Empire. Their loyalty was still to the king. The fight was with Parliament over the issue of sovereignty. The idea of overthrowing the monarchy itself, that wasn't really on the table yet.
The fuse had been lit, but it hadn't yet reached the powder keg. That escalation from protest to open war would happen over the next few years. We'll explore that journey in our next podcast.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available right now. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.